History creates legends about the weapons that took lives, the tanks, the bombers, the artillery, but it often forgets the machines that saved them. In the frozen hell of December 1944, when the mightiest army on earth was brought to its knees by the snow, salvation didn't come from a general's map. It came from a rusted garage, where two men decided that if they couldn't find a path to save their brothers, they would have to carve one out of ice and steel. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a physical thing, a living entity that hunted for any gap in your uniform, any tear in your coat, searching for the warmth of your skin like a starving wolf. It was the winter of the Battle of the Bulge, and for the men of the Logistics Corps, the enemy wasn't just the Germans hiding in the tree line with their panzers. The enemy was the temperature gauge dropping past zero. The enemy was the silence of a frozen engine block. Master Sergeant Bill Henderson, a man they called Big Daddy, walked the perimeter of the motor pool. He moved with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, or at least the weight of this entire transport company. Henderson was old breed. He had scars from the Ardennes Forest in the First Great War, and lines on his face that looked like road map gullies carved by years of Texas sun and military bureaucracy. But here in Belgium the sun was a memory. He stopped beside a row of GMC Deuce and a half trucks. These 6x6 beasts were supposed to be the pride of Detroit, the iron horses that carried the Allied war effort on their backs. But tonight, they looked like sleeping giants, defeated not by artillery, but by the snow. The snow had drifted up past the axles, cementing the rubber tires to the frozen mud. Icicles hung from the bumpers like jagged teeth. Henderson pulled a silver flask from his coat, unscrewed it, and took a swig of lukewarm coffee. It tasted like battery acid and burnt beans, but it was heat. He looked down the line. He saw the boys. They were just kids, really. 18, 19 years old. They were huddled in foxholes and makeshift shelters, wrapped in blankets that were stiff with frost. They weren't sleeping. You couldn't sleep in this. If you slept, you might not wake up. They were just vibrating, a collective shudder of hundreds of men trying to generate enough body heat to survive until dawn. He heard a metallic clang ringing out against the howling wind, a sharp, frustrated sound, metal on metal. Henderson narrowed his eyes and followed the noise. Tucked away behind a stack of empty fuel drums was a Jeep, its hood propped open. Leaning over the engine bay was a figure that looked too small for his uniform. It was Private Jimmy Baker. The kid was from Kansas, a farm boy who probably knew how to fix a combine harvester before he learned long division. Jimmy was struggling. He was wrenching on a spark plug, his breath coming in short, panicked clouds of white vapor. He wasn't wearing gloves. You couldn't feel the thread of a bolt with wool mittens, but touching American steel in sub-zero temperatures was like grabbing a hot coal. It burned. The wrench slipped. Jimmy yelped, a sound of pure frustration and pain, and the tool clattered down into the dark abyss of the engine block. The kid slammed his fist against the fender, his shoulders shaking. He didn't see the sergeant approaching. He just leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the Jeep, defeated. Henderson stepped into the small clearing. He didn't bark an order. He didn't demand a salute. He just bent down, his knees cracking audibly in the cold, and reached into the snow beneath the chassis. He fished out the wrench. It was coated in grease and ice. He stood up and tapped the young soldier on the shoulder with the tool. Jimmy jumped, spinning around, his eyes wide with fear. He tried to snap to attention, but his body was too frozen to obey. "At ease, son," Henderson rumbled. His voice sounded like gravel crunching under tires. He looked at Jimmy's hands. They were raw, red, and covered in cuts that wouldn't bleed because the cold had constricted the veins. The knuckles were swollen. "Trying to get her turning over, Sarge," Jimmy stammered, his teeth chattering so hard the words were chopped up. Captain says we need the radio jeep running by 0600, but the oil... It's like molasses, Sarge. It won't crank. I can't feel my fingers anymore." Henderson looked at the Jeep, then back at the boy. He saw the terror in Jimmy's eyes. It wasn't fear of the Germans. It was the fear of failure. The fear that because he couldn't fix this machine, someone down the line wouldn't get a message, and men would die. That was the burden every mechanic carried. They weren't pulling triggers, but they held the lives of the riflemen in their greasy hands. "Put these on," Henderson said. He began to strip off his own heavy, leather-lined gloves. They were lined with rabbit fur, a luxury he had traded 2 bottles of French wine for back in Paris. They were warm. They retained the heat of his hands. But Sarge, Jimmy protested weakly, eyeing the gloves. That's against you need them. Henderson ignored him. He shoved the gloves into the kid's chest. Take them, Baker. That's an order. You can't fix a damn thing if you lose your fingers to frostbite. And I need you to fix things. The boys in Bastogne are counting on us. They're surrounded. They're out of ammo, and they're freezing to death faster than we are. If we can't move these trucks, if we can't clear this road, they are ghosts. Jimmy hesitated, then slowly slid his raw, trembling hands into the sergeant's gloves. The relief washed over his face instantly. The warmth was a shock to his system. He looked up at the older man, confused by the act of kindness in a place so devoid of it. Henderson turned and looked out towards the tree line, where the dark silhouette of the forest met the gray sky. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that promised to bury everything they had built. He lit a cigarette, cupping the flame against the wind, the brief orange glow illuminating the deep lines of worry on his face. Listen to me, son, Henderson said softly, smoke swirling from his lips to join the blizzard. You look at that map in the command tent, and you see lines, front lines, supply lines. But out here, there are no lines. There's just us, and there's the cold. The general has his stars, and the captain has his bars, and they get the heated tents. But when the mercury drops this low, the brass freezes just as fast as the tin. He turned back to Jimmy, his eyes hard but not unkind. The wind whipped the snow around them, isolating them in a small white room. In that moment, they weren't superior and subordinate. They were just 2 men trying to keep the blood moving in their veins. Henderson nodded at the wrench in Jimmy's hand. Get that Jeep running, Baker. Then come inside. I've got a pot of coffee that tastes like mud, but it's hot. As the sergeant turned to walk back into the swirling darkness, leaving the young soldier with renewed resolve and warm hands, the lesson hung in the freezing air, heavier than the snow. It was a truth that every soldier learns eventually, usually the hard way. In this storm, under this sky, rank doesn't keep you warm. Only brotherhood does. We often tell ourselves that heroes are forged in the instant of battle, created by the sudden shock of gunfire and adrenaline. But the truth is different. A man's character isn't built in the trenches. It's revealed there. It is built long before the war begins, constructed piece by piece from the quiet lessons learned on front porches, in dusty workshops, and across golden cornfields. When the world falls apart and the manuals offer no answers, a soldier doesn't reach for his rifle. He reaches for his roots. Inside the makeshift repair depot, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the acrid scent of burning oil coming from a pot-bellied stove that was fighting a losing battle against the Belgian winter. The wind outside was still screaming, battering the wooden walls like a fist. But in here, the noise was different. It was the sound of defeat. A dozen men sat on crates and oil drums, staring at the floor. The radio in the corner, a bulky SCR 300, crackled with static and the desperate voice of a frantic operator from the forward aid station. The message was broken, but the meaning was clear enough to stop every heart in the room. The ambulances were stuck. 3 miles up the ridge, a convoy carrying the wounded had bogged down in a fresh drift. They couldn't move forward. They couldn't turn back. And the temperature was dropping. Captain Evans slammed his hand onto the map table, scattering pencils and papers. He was a good officer, a man who cared about his troops, but right now, he looked aged beyond his years. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes scanning the room, begging for a miracle that wasn't there. He asked for ideas. He asked for anything. But the room remained silent. What could they do? Shovels were useless against 5 feet of compacted snow. The bulldozers were 20 miles south, likely frozen in place themselves. The logic of the army had run out of road. But in the back of the room, near a pile of twisted scrap metal scavenged from a bombed-out railway bridge, Private Jimmy Baker wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at a ghost. Jimmy closed his eyes for a second. The smell of the diesel fumes faded, replaced by the scent of dry hay and summer rain. He wasn't in the Ardennes anymore. He was back in Kansas, standing on the edge of his father's wheat field. He saw the old John Deere tractor, a rusted hulk that his dad kept running with baling wire and prayer. He remembered the blizzard of '38 when the county roads vanished, and the cattle were starving in the lower pasture. He remembered what his father did. He didn't wait for the county plow. He walked out to the barn, fired up the cutting torch, and turned a scrap sheet of roofing tin into a lifeline. Jimmy opened his eyes. The fear was still there, churning in his stomach, but something else had taken root alongside it. A quiet, stubborn certainty. He looked at the massive GMC truck parked in the bay. To the other men, it was just a cargo hauler, useless without a road. But to Jimmy, it was just a bigger tractor. He cleared his throat. The sound was small, swallowed by the tension in the room. He tried again, louder this time. He spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. He told the captain he had an idea. Heads turned. Some eyes were hopeful, but most were dull with exhaustion. A corporal sitting near the stove let out a scoff, a sharp, dismissive sound. He muttered something about the kid losing his mind, about how this wasn't the time for farm boy daydreams. The skepticism rippled through the room. They were soldiers, trained in the art of war, and they were looking for a military solution. They couldn't see how a kid who had never fired a bazooka could solve a problem that had stumped the brass. Jimmy shrank back, his shoulders hunching. The confidence from the memory began to evaporate under the weight of their doubt. He started to apologize, to step back into the shadows where a private belonged. Then, a heavy boot struck the concrete floor. The sound was like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Master Sergeant Henderson stepped forward from the shadows. He didn't look at the captain. He didn't look at the scoffers. He looked straight at Jimmy. The old man's face was unreadable, a mask of leather and grit, but his eyes were locked on the young mechanic. He asked Jimmy to explain it again, not to the room, to him. Jimmy took a breath. He pointed to the pile of scrap metal. He pointed to the winch on the front bumper of the GMC. He started talking with his hands, shaping the air. He explained how they could take the steel plate from the wrecked half-track outside. He explained that they shouldn't try to push the snow flat, because the truck wasn't heavy enough. They needed to cut it. They needed a V-shape, like a ship's bow, to throw the weight to the sides. He talked about using the winch as a pulley system to lift the blade when they hit rocks, just like the hydraulic lift on a harvester. As he spoke, his voice grew steadier. He wasn't using military jargon. He was speaking the language of mechanics, of leverage and fulcrums, of welding arcs and stress points. He was speaking the universal language of people who work with their hands. When he finished, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was thoughtful. The corporal by the stove shook his head again, opening his mouth to argue that the chassis frames weren't built for that kind of torque, that they would snap the truck in half. Henderson cut him off. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice was low, dangerous, and absolute. He told the corporal to stow it. He said that while the rest of them were busy freezing to death and waiting for orders that would never come, this boy was actually thinking. Henderson walked over to the scrap pile. He kicked a piece of heavy iron girder. It rang out, a clear, solid note. He looked back at Jimmy, and for the first time in months, the sergeant smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a grim, wolfish baring of teeth. He turned to the captain and said simply, "We're doing it." The captain looked at the makeshift diagram Jimmy had drawn in the grease on the fender. He looked at the desperate plea for help on the radio. He looked at the boy from Kansas who was trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of the moment. The captain nodded. "You have 12 hours, the captain said. "If that truck doesn't move snow by dawn, we're walking out of here carrying the wounded on our backs." Henderson clapped a massive hand on Jimmy's shoulder, nearly buckling the kid's knees. But it wasn't a blow. It was a coronation. "You heard the man," Henderson growled, grabbing a welding mask from the bench. "Don't just stand there, son. Show us what they teach you in Kansas. Show us how a farmer goes to war." And in that moment, the hierarchy of rank dissolved. There was no officer, no sergeant, no private. There was only the problem and the solution. The spirit of the American heartland had just entered the fight. They weren't waiting for a miracle anymore. They were going to build one. There is a sacred rhythm to hard labor that drowns out the chaos of war. When the sparks begin to fly and the metal begins to yield, a soldier stops being a destroyer and remembers, for a brief, flickering moment, what it feels like to be a creator. The garage had transformed. An hour ago it was a cold tomb of silence and resignation. Now it was a cathedral of noise and fire. The darkness was constantly stabbed by the blinding blue-white arc of the welding torch, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The air was no longer stale. It was thick with the metallic taste of ozone and the smell of melting iron. Jimmy Baker was no longer the shivering kid who had dropped a wrench in the snow. He was in his element. He moved around the front of the massive GMC truck with a fluidity that bordered on artistic. He had pulled the welding goggles down over his eyes, masking his youth, turning him into a faceless craftsman. In his hand, the torch hissed like a snake, fusing the scavenged armor plate to the truck's steel frame. And right beside him, holding the heavy steel girder in place with nothing but brute strength and grit, was Master Sergeant Henderson. It was a sight that would have confused any spit-and-polish officer from Washington. Here was the highest-ranking NCO in the company, a man who terrified fresh recruits with a single glance, taking orders from a private. When Jimmy nodded his head to the left, Henderson shifted the weight. When Jimmy signaled for more rod, Henderson handed it to him. The hierarchy of the army had been burned away by the welding torch, leaving only two men working toward a single purpose. They worked through the witching hour. The cold seeped through the cracks in the door, but the heat radiating from the work kept them moving. Sweat carved trails through the grease on their faces. During a brief pause to let the metal cool, Henderson leaned back against a stack of tires, wiping his forehead with a rag that was black with oil. He watched Jimmy run a gloved hand over a fresh weld, checking for cracks. "You've got a steady hand, Baker," Henderson said, his voice raspy from the fumes. "I haven't seen a bead that clean since I worked the shipyards in Norfolk back in '32. Jimmy looked up, surprised by the compliment. He cracked a shy smile. "My dad taught me, Sarge. Said if a weld looks like bird droppings, it'll hold like bird droppings. On a farm, if the plow breaks, you don't eat, so you learn to make it hold." Henderson nodded slowly, lighting a cigarette and offering the pack to the kid. "Back in the First War," Henderson began, looking at the glowing tip of the cigarette, "we didn't have half this gear. If we got stuck in the mud in the Argonne, we used mules and curses. Mostly curses. We died in the mud because we couldn't move. I swore if I ever commanded men, I wouldn't let the ground swallow them up." He exhaled a plume of smoke, looking at the monstrous contraption taking shape on the front of the truck. "You're saving lives tonight, son. Don't forget that." Jimmy took the cigarette, though he didn't really smoke. He held it like a talisman. "When this is over, Sarge," Jimmy said quietly, "I want to open my own shop. Just a small place. Fix tractors, maybe some of those new automobiles. I just want to fix things. I'm tired of breaking them." Henderson looked at the boy. He saw the innocence that the war was trying so hard to crush, and he saw the resilience that was keeping it alive. "You will," Henderson said firmly. "You'll get that shop. But first, we have to get this beast moving." They went back to work with renewed ferocity. The night dragged on, but they didn't slow down. They fashioned the lift system using the truck's front winch, threading the steel cable through a pulley they had cut from a wrecked crane. It was crude. It was ugly. It was a Frankenstein's monster of American engineering, stitched together with scrap metal and desperation. But as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the windows, they stepped back. The GMC truck sat there, transformed. A massive V-shaped prow of dark steel jutted out from its nose, reinforced with I-beams and anger. It looked like a medieval battering ram welded onto a modern machine. It wasn't built for parades. It wasn't built for inspection. It was built for violence against the elements. Henderson walked up to the plow. He kicked it with his heavy boot. The sound was a dull, solid thud. It didn't rattle. It didn't shake. It was solid as a rock. He looked at Jimmy, and for the first time, he didn't see a farm boy. He saw a soldier. He saw an engineer. He saw the future of his country standing there in greasy coveralls. "Americans don't wait for miracles, Baker," Henderson said, his voice low and full of pride. "We build them with calloused hands and sweat. Now start her up. Let's go wake up the devil." There comes a terrifying moment in every war when the rule book runs out of pages. In that silence, when the strict arithmetic of logistics fails and the odds are stacked against survival, you stop looking at the rank on a man's collar. You stop trusting the equipment. You stop trusting the strategy. You bet on the only thing left that matters. You bet on the human heart beating inside the uniform. A machine is just cold scrap metal until it is driven by a brave soul, and trust is the only fuel that burns hot enough to melt the ice. The heavy wooden doors of the repair depot groaned in protest as they were shoved open, breaking the seal of frost that had formed during the night. A cloud of steam billowed out into the freezing gray morning, followed by the deep, throaty growl of a six-cylinder engine coming to life. Slowly, the beast emerged. In the harsh, unforgiving light of day, the modified GMC truck looked even more monstrous than it had in the shadows of the workshop. It was ugly. There was no other word for it. The V-shaped plow, cut from the armor of a dead half-track, was scarred and black, welded onto the nose of the truck like a medieval battering ram. The bed of the truck was piled high with sandbags, pressing the chain tires deep into the frozen mud. It didn't look like a military vehicle. It looked like a desperate prayer forged in iron. Captain Evans stood by the command tent, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Beside him stood a lieutenant from the engineering corps who had arrived overnight, a man who lived his life by slide rules and safety regulations. The lieutenant stepped forward, his face pale with disbelief. He waved his arms frantically, signaling for the truck to stop. The brakes squealed, and the massive machine shuddered to a halt just feet from the officers, the plow blade hovering inches above the snow. The lieutenant didn't wait for a salute. He walked right up to the plow, kicking the steel blade with disdain. He turned to the captain, his voice thin in the howling wind. He called it suicide. He pointed out the stress points on the front axle, arguing that the extra weight would snap the chassis in the first 100 yards. He claimed it would kill the driver and block the only supply route permanently. Captain Evans looked at the truck, then at the map in his hand. He was torn. He saw the danger the lieutenant saw. If this truck broke down in the middle of the pass, the supply line wouldn't just be blocked, it would be sealed shut. He turned to Sergeant Henderson. He hesitated, admitting that maybe the lieutenant was right. It was a gamble they couldn't afford to lose. The engine idled, a rhythmic, thumping heartbeat that vibrated through the ground. Inside the cab, Jimmy Baker sat gripping the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. He heard the officers. He saw the doubt on their faces. He felt the crushing weight of the sandbags behind him and the weight of the mission in front of him. He started to reach for the ignition key to turn it off, his confidence wavering under the gaze of authority. But then, a hand reached through the open window and grabbed his wrist. It was Henderson. The old sergeant didn't look at Jimmy. He turned his back to the truck and walked straight up to the officers. He towered over the lieutenant, ignoring the man's rank, commanding the space with the sheer force of his presence. He spoke with a voice like gravel crunching under tires. He told the lieutenant that he was looking at the steel, calculating torque and load limits, but he was missing the point entirely. Henderson pointed a gloved finger back at the cab where Jimmy sat frozen. He told the captain that he hadn't spent all night watching that boy weld just to build a snowplow. He had watched him pour his guts into that iron. He knew every bolt, every seam, every weak point. He wasn't just driving it. He was the truck. The wind howled around them, whipping snow against their faces. But Henderson didn't blink. He admitted it was a gamble. But he told them he wasn't betting on the chassis, and he wasn't betting on the engine. He was betting on Private Baker. He was betting on the kid who refused to sleep because he knew his brothers were dying up that ridge. Henderson's voice softened just a fraction, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. He said that a machine will always fail you eventually, but a man with a purpose? He will drive that pile of junk through the gates of hell if you let him. Captain Evans looked at Henderson. Then he looked past him, to the young face in the window of the truck. He saw the fear in Jimmy's eyes, yes, but he also saw something else. He saw the set jaw. He saw the determination of the American heartland. The captain turned to the lieutenant and ordered him to stand down. Henderson cracked a grin. He walked to the passenger side and climbed up into the cab. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic finality. Inside, the cab was cold and smelled of gasoline and wet canvas. Henderson looked over at Jimmy. The kid was trembling slightly. Henderson pulled a map from his pocket. He told Jimmy that the brass was done talking. Now it was just the two of them in the snow. Jimmy took a deep breath. He shifted the massive transmission into low gear. He looked at the plow blade sitting on the white expanse ahead of them. He asked if the sergeant was ready. Henderson nodded. He told the boy to let her rip. Jimmy stomped on the gas pedal. The engine roared, a defiant scream against the storm. The chains bit into the ice, throwing up rooster tails of frozen slush. The truck lurched forward, gaining speed, heading straight for the wall of white that blocked the world. The gamble had begun. There is an old saying in the Army, When you find yourself going through hell, keep going. Momentum is the only thing that separates the living from the dead. In the blinding whiteout of the Ardennes, there is no turning back, no pausing for breath. There is only the roar of the engine and the terrifying realization that the only way home is through the impossible. Inside the cab of the GMC, the world had shrunk to the size of the windshield. Beyond the glass, there was nothing but a swirling vortex of white. The wipers slapped frantically back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the storm. Jimmy Baker wrestled with the steering wheel. It wasn't driving, it was hand-to-hand combat. The truck bucked and kicked like a wild animal as the steel plow tore through 4 feet of compacted snow. The noise was deafening. The screech of metal scraping against ice, the roar of the Jimmy engine redlining, and the constant rattle of the chains on the tires created a symphony of violence. Beside him, Sergeant Henderson was leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, scanning the void. His hand hovered over the lever they had jury-rigged to control the winch. Every time the nose of the truck dipped, Henderson shouted a command, and they adjusted the blade, keeping the beast moving. Suddenly, a massive jolt rocked the entire chassis. Metal screamed against stone. The truck stopped dead, throwing both men forward. Jimmy's head cracked against the steering wheel. The engine stalled. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Jimmy gasped, clutching his forehead. Blood trickled down into his eye, mixing with the sweat and grease. He looked at the dashboard, his eyes wide with panic. "I broke it," Jimmy stammered, his voice rising in hysteria. "I hit something solid, Sarge. The axle. It's gotta be the axle. We're stuck. Oh God, we're stuck." He reached for the door handle, ready to bail out, ready to give up. The cold air of failure was already seeping in. "Baker!" The shout filled the small cab. Henderson grabbed the boy's shoulder and squeezed hard. He didn't look at the blood. He looked into Jimmy's eyes. "Look at me," Henderson commanded. "You didn't break it. It's just a rock. It's just a stump. You're not in Belgium, son. You're in the North Field back in Kansas. You've hit stumps before. What do you do?" Jimmy blinked, his breathing ragged. The mention of home cut through the panic. I back up," Jimmy whispered. "I lift the blade. I hit it again." "That's right," Henderson said, his voice calm, an anchor in the storm. "We don't quit. Those boys up the road don't have time for us to quit." Henderson reached out and turned the ignition key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life. "Put it in reverse," Henderson said. "I'll work the winch. When I say go, you put your foot through the floorboard." Jimmy wiped the blood from his eye. He shifted gears. The truck groaned as it backed away from the invisible obstacle. "Now!" Henderson yelled, cranking the winch handle, lifting the heavy steel plow just inches off the ground. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He slammed the accelerator down. The truck surged forward. The chains chewed into the ice. Wham! They hit the drift with the force of a freight train. The truck shuddered violently, threatening to tip over. But then, there was a feeling of release. The steel blade sliced through the obstacle, shattering the ice and throwing it aside. The truck lurched forward, breaking free, picking up speed. Through the swirling snow ahead, a dark shape appeared. Then another. It was the convoy. Jimmy let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since 1941. They were through. The road was open. They hadn't just cleared the snow. They had cleared a path for life to return. The end of the world didn't look like a finish line. It looked like a graveyard of snow-covered shapes huddled together in the gloom of the Belgian forest. The stranded convoy had been waiting for 2 days. The ambulances were cold iron tombs. Inside, the wounded men had stopped groaning hours ago, settling into the dangerous lethargy of hypothermia. The medics were burning empty crates and medical supply boxes just to keep a flicker of heat alive. Hope hadn't just run out, it had frozen solid. Then they felt it. It started as a vibration in the ground, a low-frequency tremor that shook the icicles from the fenders of the jeeps. Then came the sound. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a tank tread, nor the drone of an airplane. It was a roar. A guttural, mechanical scream of an engine being pushed past its breaking point. Heads popped up from foxholes. Medics stepped out of the back of the ambulances, squinting into the blinding white curtain of the storm. Suddenly, the wall of snow at the bend of the road exploded. Like a sea monster breaching the surface, the modified GMC burst through the drift. The V-shaped plow battered and scraped down to bare metal, through a massive wave of ice to either side. The truck was smoking, steam hissing violently from the radiator grill, but it was moving. It was unstoppable. It rumbled toward them, a scarred, ugly, magnificent beast. As it ground to a halt in the center of the clearing, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of awe. The driver's door creaked open. Private Jimmy Baker stumbled out. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a wreck. His face was smeared with grease and dried blood from the cut on his forehead. His legs were shaking so hard he had to grab the side mirror to stay upright. He looked at the line of ambulances, then down at his trembling hands. Master Sergeant Henderson climbed out of the passenger side. He walked around the front of the truck, placing a hand on the steaming hood, patting it like one would pat the flank of a loyal horse that had run until its heart nearly burst. A medic ran forward, his eyes wide. He didn't salute. He just grabbed Jimmy's hand and shook it, pumping it up and down, tears freezing on his cheeks. "We were out," the medic choked out. "We were out of morphine. We were out of fuel. You guys—" Jimmy tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He just nodded. Henderson walked over, lighting a cigarette with a steady hand. He looked at the medic, then at the soldiers beginning to emerge from their shelters, cheering, waving, crying. "Get them moving," Henderson said quietly. "The road is open, but not for long. Get them out of here." As the convoy began to scramble, engines turning over, gears grinding, the two men stood aside. They watched the ambulances roll past, one by one. Through the dirty glass of the rear windows, they could see the shapes of the wounded on stretchers. They didn't know their names. They would never know who lived and who died. But they knew one thing. Those men were going home. Or at least, they had a fighting chance, because of a farm boy and a pile of scrap metal. When the last taillight faded into the distance, Jimmy slumped against the giant tire of the GMC. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. "Sarge?" Jimmy asked softly. "Yeah, son? Do you think they'll give us a medal for this?" Henderson laughed, a short, dry bark of a sound. He looked at the ugly welded plow, at the Frankenstein truck that had defied every regulation in the manual. "No, Jimmy," Henderson said. "They don't give medals for welding. They don't give silver stars for fixing trucks. History will write about the generals. It'll write about the tanks and the paratroopers. People like us? We're just the grease in the gears. We're invisible." He took a drag of his cigarette and looked up at the gray sky. "But we know," Henderson whispered, "and the men in those ambulances know. That's enough. Years from now, we will look back at these black and white photographs. We see the grim faces, the muddy uniforms, the machines of war. It is easy to see them as distant history, as characters in a movie. But we must remember that they lived in color. They felt the biting cold just as we do. They felt fear and doubt, and the overwhelming desire to just give up and lie down in the snow. But they didn't. The story of the Winter Warrior isn't just about a truck. It's a testament to the American spirit that refuses to accept the impossible. It reminds us that salvation doesn't always arrive on the wings of angels or the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it arrives on 6 wheels, driven by dirty, exhausted men who simply refuse to leave their brothers behind. Today, that GMC is long gone, likely rusted away in a scrapyard or melted down to build the skyscrapers of a new era. But the path it cleared remains. We walk on the roads they built. We live in the freedom they preserved. And every time we solve a problem with our own hands, every time we refuse to quit when the storm gets loud, we are keeping their fire alive. As the snow began to bury their tracks once more, Henderson put his arm around the young private's shoulder. 2 generations, 1 mission. "Come on, Kansas," the old sergeant said. "Let's turn this rig around. There's more snow falling. Freedom isn't free. We often say the price is paid in blood, and it is. But sometimes the price is paid in sweat, in grease, and in the stubborn, defiant act of clearing a path through the darkness, just so someone else can find their way home."